There are 20 sons of the Emperor. That sentence alone should stop you cold, because if you have spent any real time in Warhammer 40,000 lore, you know that is not what the books say. The codices say 18. The Black Library novels, for the most part, reference 18. Most of the Primarchs themselves, in the rare and carefully guarded moments when they speak of their brotherhood, count 18. The Imperium of man, the greatest civilization humanity has ever built or will ever build, a structure that spans 1,000,000 worlds and has endured for 10,000 years, constructed an entire mythological framework around 18 demigods, and never once publicly acknowledged that 2 more existed. And yet, they did exist. There were 20. We know this because the evidence is right there at the edges of the record, hiding in the spaces between paragraphs, lurking in the deliberate redaction marks. In the too careful way, certain characters steer conversations away from certain numbers. In the conspicuous absence that you notice only when you look for it. We know it because Robert Guillemot himself confirmed it, speaking quietly to a bewildered priest during the Indomitus Crusade in the 41st millennium, a priest who had been taught by the ecclesiarchy that only 18 Primarchs had ever walked among the stars. Guillemot looked at the priest the way you might look at someone who has just confidently told you the sun orbits the earth, and he said with devastating, tired finality, "No, 20. Your church is ignorant of many things. 2 of the Emperor's sons have been erased from history. Not just hidden, not just classified, erased. Their names, scraped from every stone they were ever carved into. Their deeds, burned from every record they were ever written into. Their faces, removed from the statues that once bore their likenesses in the ceremonial halls of the Imperial Palace on Terra. Even the memories of the people who knew them personally, even the memories of their own brother Primarchs, deliberately and systematically altered, so that what remained in those massive, superhuman minds was nothing more than a faint unease, a nagging sense that something had once been there, like the outline of a picture that used to hang on a wall, and left only a slightly lighter patch of paint to suggest it ever existed at all. This is not the kind of erasure that happens when someone loses a battle or makes a political enemy. This is something else entirely. A different order of magnitude, a different kind of decision, executed with thoroughness that required tremendous effort and the cooperation of the most powerful individuals who had ever lived. The Chaos Primarchs, the traitors who killed millions, who drove a dagger into the heart of the Imperium and held it there for years, were not erased. Their names survive. Their deeds, however monstrous, are on record. The Emperor's children, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, the Word-Bearers, their sins were catalogued, condemned, and remembered. They live on in infamy, worshipped in certain dark corners, and feared in all the rest. Even Horus himself, the son who drove a spear through the Emperor's side and nearly ended 10,000 years of civilization in a single night of desperate combat at the Siege of Terra, was not struck from the record. The heresy still bears his name. You can walk into any imperial church in the 41st millennium and hear Horus mentioned, cursed, and spat upon. His memory is kept alive because it serves a purpose. It tells the faithful what evil looks like when it wears a familiar face. But the 2nd and the 11th Primarchs do not even get that. They do not get to be cautionary tales. They do not get to be curses. They get nothing, because nothing is what the Imperium decided they should have. The traitors were condemned and remembered. The lost were simply removed. Whatever the 2nd and 11th Primarchs did was, by the cold implication of this treatment, not something that could be condemned and used as a warning. It was something that, if remembered at all, would do damage. The difference between a sin that is condemned and a sin that is erased is not one of severity, it is one of threat. You erase the things that, if remembered, would undermine everything else you have carefully constructed. You erase the things that ask questions no one should be asking, and you maintain that erasure with a thoroughness that amounts to institutional violence against memory itself. Rogel Dorn, the Imperial Fist's Primarch, one of the most stoic, rational, and unshakable minds that had ever existed in 10,000 years of human history, stood in a corridor of the Imperial Palace not long before the Siege of Terra, staring at 2 empty plinths in the falls of the Kathmandu precinct. He knew these plinths. He had walked past them countless times, and he noted, in the way that someone notes something they cannot quite bring themselves to examine directly, that they had been vacant for a long time, that no one ever spoke of those two absent brothers, and that their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations at the time. He used the word tragedies. He did not say crimes. He did not say betrayals. He did not say punishments or executions or necessary evils. He said tragedies. And then he asked himself quietly, in the interior voice of a man who has been trained to solve problems and finds himself unable to solve this one, whether those tragedies had, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded. He was right to wonder, but he could not follow the thought because the memories had been taken from him long before, and we will get to exactly how and why. That is what we are going to explore today. We are going to go through every fragment of evidence, every whisper, every slipped word and redacted sentence and deliberate narrative gap, and we are going to try to construct the most coherent picture we can of what actually happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs of the Space Marine Legions. We will look at the books that almost told us, the timeline entries that are redacted instead of simply absent, the characters who start sentences they cannot finish, the art books that stamp the word classified over gray silhouettes where names and faces should be. I want to be absolutely clear from the start. Games Workshop has never given a definitive answer. The names of the Lost Primarchs have never been officially confirmed. Their homeworlds are not on any published map. Their legions' names are not in any codex. What happened to them is not stated in any single source with clarity or finality. What we have are breadcrumbs. Dozens and dozens of breadcrumbs dropped across novels, short stories, codices, rulebooks, audio dramas, and cryptic editorial notes spanning nearly 4 decades of published material. But breadcrumbs, laid carefully enough and consistently enough by people who are clearly coordinating, form a path. And that path leads somewhere very dark, very specific, and very, very quiet. Let us walk it together, slowly, and see where it takes us. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love seeing where this community reaches, and I read every single comment. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Hit that button. We go this deep on every topic we cover, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. Section 2. How the Primarchs were made and why it matters. To understand how 2 of 20 suns could be lost, you first have to understand what the Primarchs were, what they were designed to be, and what their creation says about the Emperor's ambitions and fears. Because the story of their creation is also, quietly and inextricably, the first chapter of the story of their disappearance. The Emperor of Mankind had, depending on which source you trust and which part of the mythology you follow, been alive for somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 years by the time he began the Great Crusade in the early 30th millennium. He had watched civilizations rise and burn. He had guided and sometimes toppled entire empires from positions of anonymity, moving through human history like a slow tide. He had battled daemons and alien intelligences and the slow, grinding entropy that had eaten the human race for millennium after millennium during the catastrophic era known as the Age of Strife. He had seen what Old Night looked like from the inside, the psychic storms that cut every human colony off from every other, the warp-spawned horrors that flooded into a galaxy suddenly full of screaming human minds with no psychic protection, the simple grinding death of isolation, and the despair of a species that had been alone in the dark for so long, it had begun to forget it had ever been anything else. And he had concluded, with the cold certainty of a being who had thought about nothing else for most of recorded history, that humanity needed more than just armies. It needed inheritors. Not just warriors, but paragons. Living weapons that were also living ideas. The distillation of everything a human being could theoretically become, if every limitation of biology and upbringing and chance was removed, and every virtue and capacity was amplified to its absolute theoretical maximum. He needed sons. The project that created the Primarchs was unlike anything that had ever been attempted or ever would be attempted again. It drew on genetic science so advanced it was functionally indistinguishable from the most sophisticated alchemy, on psychic manipulation at a scale that bent the laws of physics as ordinary humans understood them, and on a kind of deliberate mythological engineering. Each Primarch was designed not just to fight, but to inspire, not just to command, but to embody something specific and necessary. Lemon Russ embodied savage loyalty. Robot Guillemon embodied order and the careful administration of vast systems. Sanguinius embodied hope and beauty, and the willingness to sacrifice either. Vulcan embodied endurance and mercy in a galaxy that offered little of either. Each was a specific answer to a specific question about what a galaxy-spanning civilization would need to survive. 20 of these beings were created. 20 incubation capsules were prepared in a facility deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, tended by the Emperor's most trusted servants, and watched over with a care that bordered on the obsessive. The Emperor had poured everything into this project: his knowledge, his psychic power, his genetic craft, his accumulated understanding of what made certain humans exceptional. He had made 20 children, each one a masterpiece, and each one irreplaceable. And then, before the Primarchs were old enough to speak or stand or understand what they were, the Chaos Gods intervened. The exact mechanism has never been fully described in any official source, and whether this is deliberate narrative restraint or simply a decision not to commit to one explanation is unclear. What we know is the result, which is not disputed. A warp vortex swept through the gestation chambers and scattered all 20 capsules across the galaxy. They drifted through the Imperium, each on their own trajectory, carried by currents that follow no physical law. Each eventually came to rest on some distant, human-inhabited world. The Emperor, watching his life's most important project vanish into the warp in a moment of cosmic violence, would have experienced something that the man he is depicted as being very rarely felt: helplessness. Real, genuine helplessness in the face of forces he could not control and had not been able to anticipate or prevent. He launched the Great Crusade partly to conquer the galaxy for humanity and eliminate the Xenos threats that had preyed on human worlds during the Age of Strife, yes. But he launched it equally, perhaps primarily, to find his sons and bring them home. The Primarchs drifted in their capsules through the warp and emerged on their various destination worlds. Each one landed, each capsule cracked open, and each being inside, impossibly powerful, impossibly driven, physically perfected to a degree that no human being had ever approached, began to grow up. And wherever they grew up, remarkable things happened, because Primarchs cannot help but change the worlds they inhabit simply by existing in them. Their genetic superiority is so complete, their psychic presence so overwhelming, their intelligence and charisma so far beyond any human norm, that societies reshape themselves around them. Some were adopted by human families and raised with something approaching a normal childhood, if an increasingly abnormal one. Some rose from nothing through sheer force of capability. Some, like Conrad Kurz on the dying world of Nostromo, survived utterly alone in conditions that would have killed any 10 ordinary humans within days. The Emperor's record clearly states that over the course of the Great Crusade, he was reunited with each Primarch in turn, and each had risen to a position of authority on the world where they were found. This consistency across 20 wildly different worlds and 20 wildly different circumstances is itself a statement about what Primarchs are forces of nature too powerful and too purposeful to remain in any station below the highest. Here is where the first truly important detail enters the story. The timeline of Primarch rediscovery is imprecise and fragmentary, but we have some hard data points. The official Horus Heresy website contained at one point a timeline listing discovery dates for the various Primarchs. 2 of these entries were simply labeled Discovery of Redacted. One was dated to the year 821 M30, which would place it as the 3rd discovery in the sequence very early in the Crusade, only a couple of decades in. The other was dated 927 M30, which would make it the 19th discovery. Just before Alfarius, who was known across the legions as the last brother found, the one who earned himself the nickname The Last. Think about what that spread means for a moment. The Crusade ran from approximately 798 M30 to around 005 M31, a period of about 2.5 centuries. The first Primarch discovered was Horus, very early on. The last was Alfarius, just before the heresy. One of the lost Primarchs was found almost at the very beginning, a contemporary of the earliest sons, someone who would have known the Great Crusade from its first steps. He presumably fought for decades, possibly close to a century or more. He presumably had relationships with his brothers, led his legion into battle across hundreds of worlds, and did things worthy of being called glories. The other was found much later, well into the second half of the Crusades' duration, with less than a century between his discovery and the outbreak of the Horus heresy. His tenure as a Primarch, as an active and acknowledged son of the Emperor, would have been comparatively brief. Whatever happened in that shorter period was compressed, urgent, perhaps accelerated by circumstances that left him little time to find his footing. 2 different timelines, 2 different relationships with the Great Crusade, 2 different sets of experiences, 2 different stories that both ended the same way, in silence and erasure. The critical thing that every piece of evidence agrees on is that whatever went wrong, it was already over before the Horus heresy began. By the time Horus raised his banner at Istvan, the 2nd and 11th legions were already gone. The First Heretic, a novel set decades before the heresy, references only 18 legions operating during a discussion between Lorgar and Magnus. Prospero Burns, set just before the burning of Prospero, which itself preceded the full outbreak of the heresy, contains a character who casually refers to the fortress homes of the Emperor's 18 legions Astartes, as if that number is simply the number and has always been the number. The novel Betrayer, set during the heresy itself, explicitly uses the phrase 18 legions in a way that makes clear this is the factual count at the time. Whatever happened to the 2nd and 11th happened during the Great Crusade, during what was supposed to be humanity's greatest triumph, during the age when the Emperor was at the height of his power, when his sons stood at his side, when the Imperium was being built rather than merely maintained. The erasure happened during the Golden Age, not during the fall. And that might be the most disturbing element of the entire story. Something went wrong in the light, not the dark. 2 of the Emperor's sons failed, or fell, or were destroyed, not during the chaos of civil war, but during the structured, purposeful years when everything was supposed to be working. And whatever it was bad enough that it had to be hidden before anyone could notice it. Section 3. 20 went out. 18 came back, the first clues in the record. The most remarkable thing about the evidence for the lost Primarchs is not any single piece of it, because no single piece of it is definitive. What is remarkable is the sheer consistency and the accumulated weight of dozens of small gestures, each one pointing in the same direction, from dozens of different authors writing across decades of published material who all found different ways to gesture at the same blank space in the record. They hint, they imply, they have characters, start sentences, and then stop. They leave redaction marks in official histories that are not blank, but are specifically marked as redacted as actively suppressed, rather than simply absent. They return to the subject again and again with the compulsive energy of people who cannot help picking at a thread they know they are not supposed to pull. And crucially, they never directly contradict each other on the core mystery, even as they add new layers and new textures to the ambiguity surrounding it. Let us start with the oldest and most fundamental evidence, the numbers themselves. When the Space Marine legions are listed in official Imperial records, they run from 1 to 20. The first legion is the Dark Angels, led by Lion L. Johnson. The third is the Emperor's Children, led by Fulgrim. The numbers exist in the list. The 2nd and 11th Legion numbers exist. They are there in the count. But where a name and Primarch should be associated with each number, there is simply nothing, or rather, there is something. And that something is a note that the records have been expunged or destroyed. Earlier sources, such as the 2nd edition Ultramarines Codex, stated that the records were deleted following the heresy. That was one explanation. It implied the legions had been traitors, and their records had been purged as part of the general excommunication of Chaos forces. But later, more detailed sources complicate that picture enormously. The Horus Heresy Book 1, Betrayal, produced by Forge World, includes a table listing all 20 legions. The entries for Legions 2 and 11 are blacked out specifically. They are represented as text that has been physically obscured by a black bar, as if someone has taken a marker to the page. This is not simply blank space. The text is clearly there beneath the bar. And this matters because fans, with characteristic obsessive attention to detail, measured the black bars and deduced information from the lengths of the obscured text. The name of the second legion appears to be quite long, approximately as long as Emperor's Children. The name of the 11th legion is shorter, approximately as long as Thousand Sons. The name of the second Primarch appears to be a single name of moderate length, similar to Alfarius. The name of the 11th Primarch is slightly longer, suggesting perhaps either two names or one name with a title. These are inferences from the physical dimensions of censored text. They are not confirmed facts, but they are the only physical data we have about the names of these legions, and they point towards specificity rather than vagueness. These were real names, real words, real identities, that someone decided to cover up with a black bar rather than simply leave blank. The deliberateness of the redaction is itself information. The novel The Lightning Tower, written by Dan Abnett, is set during the fortification of Terra in the final years before the siege. Rogel Dorn is walking through the falls of the Kathmandu precinct within the Imperial Palace. He passes a row of pillars, each bearing a life-size statue of one of the Primarchs. He knows these statues. He has walked past them countless times across the years. And then he notices, as if for perhaps the first time, or as if noticing for the 1,000th time, but being unable to truly process the information that two of the plinths are empty. The second and 11th. The second and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time, Abnett writes. No one ever spoke of those two absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? That last sentence is doing tremendous narrative work. Dorn is standing at what he knows might be the beginning of the end of everything, watching one brother after another choose chaos, watching the Imperium he helped to build begin to fracture at every joint, and he is asking whether the disappearance of two brothers years or decades earlier was not an isolated tragedy but a structural warning, a sign that the entire project was flawed, that Primarchs could fail, that the Emperor's sons were not the guaranteed paragons they had been presented as, that the Golden Age had been built on a foundation that was not as solid as everyone believed. He asks the question and cannot answer it because the memories are not there to draw on. That absence, too, tells us something. From 1,000 Sons, a conversation during the Ulanor triumph between Magnus the Red and Mortarion gives us another angle. Magnus begins to say something about a time when all the Primarchs had been gathered together, making reference to some specific past event, and Mortarion cuts him off with a precision that suggests he has been waiting for exactly this moment. The Emperor forbade us to speak of it again, Mortarion says, and his voice is described as carrying absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from a prohibition that has been stated clearly and reinforced over time. 2. Do you disobey that command? This is not Mortarion reminding Magnus of social etiquette. This is Mortarion invoking a direct, explicit prohibition from the Emperor himself, delivered not as a preference, but as a command. Magnus, who famously does not let anyone or anything stop him from pursuing knowledge he wants to pursue, goes quiet. The Emperor told his sons not to speak of a specific past event involving all 20 of them gathered together. And even Magnus the Red, the Sorcerer King who would later shatter the wards of the Sanctum Imperialis to deliver a warning directly into the Emperor's skull, and who considered most rules to be guidelines for lesser minds, even Magnus obeys this. 1. At least in front of Mortarion. From Fear to Tread, we get perhaps the most emotionally raw fragment of all. Horus has discovered Sanguinius's terrible secret, the Red Thirst, the gene seed flaw that turns blood angels into mindless engines of destruction if they give themselves over to it. Horus presses his brother on why he never went to the Emperor for help, why he never asked his fellow Primarchs for support in managing this crisis. The blood angels could have used assistance. The flaw has been claiming lives for decades, and yet Sanguinius has kept it secret, hidden it from even his own legion's rank and file. When Horus asks why, Sanguinius's response is visceral with a very specific kind of fear. You know the reason. I will not be responsible for the erasure of the blood angels from imperial history. I will not have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial. A third empty plinth. Before the heresy has even truly begun, before Horus has turned traitor, before any of the catastrophes that will fill the next century of history have yet occurred, Sanguinius already knows that 2 plinths are empty. He knows why. He has looked at those two empty pedestals and understood with absolute clarity that the Emperor is willing to erase a legion that is no longer useful or no longer safe. And he is terrified, with all the grace and beauty and sorrow that defines him, that the red thirst might be the thing that earns his people the same fate. The fear in his voice is not the fear of punishment in the normal sense. It is the fear of annihilation, of being written out, of becoming a whisper that even the people who loved you are not allowed to speak aloud. Vulcan, in the novel Vulcan Lives, adds another layer. He is speaking to his equerry Artellus Numion about his concerns regarding the Night Haunter, Conrad Kurz, whose behavior is growing increasingly troubling. Numion asks whether Vulcan should not raise these concerns with other Primarchs, with Horus or Rogel Dorn. Vulcan responds, "None of us wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great investiary, another brother's name excised from all record. It is shame enough to bear the grief for two. I have no wish to add to it." Grief. Not relief that problems had been solved, not satisfaction that the weak links had been removed from the chain. Grief. The kind of grief that comes from losing someone you cared about. The kind that sits heavy and does not lift even when you tell yourself the loss was necessary. Vulcan is telling his equerry that the other Primarchs are already grieving two absent brothers, and the thought of a third is something he cannot bear. The emotional tenor of his words is not that of a man describing the execution of enemies. It is the emotional tenor of a man describing the deaths of people he loved. And finally, from the novel Deliverance Lost, Corax, the Raven Guard Primarch, is having his first full conversation with the Emperor after being found and brought back to the palace. At some point, as they talk about the other Primarchs, Corax asks a natural mathematical question. If he is the 19th Primarch, how can there be only 17 others? 18 minus 1 is 17, and he has been told there are 17 brothers. But 19 minus 17 is 2, not 1. The math does not work. The Emperor's face becomes bleak. The specific word used is bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He does not become angry. He does not become evasive. He becomes sorrowful in the specific, heavy way that someone becomes sorrowful when asked about a loss that has not stopped hurting. He says it is a conversation for another day. That conversation never happens in any published material. The Emperor never explains to Corax what became of the two missing sons. But the sorrow on his face, described with such particular care by the author, tells us something important. These were not enemies that the Emperor destroyed without feeling. These were sons he lost. And the loss still aches, even for a being as vast and ancient as him. Every single one of these fragments points in the same direction. The tone is consistent across sources and across decades. This is not a story about traitors who were justly punished and whose memory is a convenient embarrassment to suppress. This is a story about loss, about tragedy, about sons who were gone and whose absence left wounds that never fully healed in the people who remembered them. Section 4. The Second Legion, the Quiet Brother. Of the two lost Primarchs, the second is the one about whom we have slightly more personality information. This is almost entirely thanks to a single passage in the novel Fulgrim, the Palatine Phoenix, a prequel novel set during the early Great Crusade that gives us the closest thing we have to a personal description of any of the two missing sons. In this novel, Fulgrim of the Emperor's children is reflecting on the early days of his legion's independence. The Emperor's children, at the time Fulgrim took command, were in a catastrophically fragile state. A disaster early in their history had left them with barely 200 Space Marines surviving from what had been a full legion. They were dependent on other legions, operating in the shadow of Horus and the Luna Wolves, unable to undertake independent operations without risking complete annihilation. When Fulgrim first appeared before his brothers and presented himself as the master of this damaged institution, several of the Primarchs had doubted him, spoken against him, questioned whether such a diminished force could function as an independent legion under any circumstances. Among those who had spoken against him, Fulgrim recalls, was the Primarch of the Second Legion, and Fulgrim describes him with specificity that feels deliberate, as if the author understood that this passage would be mined for every fragment of information it contained. He calls him the normally contemplative master of the Second, who broke his silence to join the chorus of doubt. Contemplative is a careful word choice. It suggests not just thoughtfulness, but the kind of philosophical depth that tends toward withdrawal, toward internal processing rather than outward expression. It suggests a Primarch who observed before speaking, who considered before acting, who perhaps valued the interior life in ways that most of his brothers, warriors first, and thinkers second or third, did not. Fulgrim goes on to describe him as quiet and humorless, and he notes that the second Primarch's act of speaking up was itself notable, because it was unusual. This was someone who did not often voice his opinions in group settings, making his criticism more pointed precisely because it was rare. Fulgrim also calls him a hypocrite for criticizing others' hubris, which implies that the second Primarch had his own version of pride, not the flashy, performative pride of Fulgrim himself, or the martial arrogance of Perturabo, but perhaps a quieter, more deeply rooted sense of his own rightness, the kind of pride that comes from a person who believes they have thought through the important questions and arrived at correct answers. The kind of pride that keeps its voice low but is no less certain of itself for the restraint. This portrait, quiet, contemplative, humorless, self-contained, speaking rarely but carrying authority when he did speak, is a distinctive personality type. It stands out from the rest of the Primarchs precisely because it is the opposite of what we usually associate with demigod warriors. Horus was magnetic and outward-facing. Magnus was brilliantly, exhaustingly verbal. Fulgrim himself was obsessively performative. Even the more reserved Primarchs, like Rogel Dorn, had a certain iron rigidity that expressed itself in constant activity and endless building. The second, as Fulgrim describes him, sounds almost ascetic, withdrawn, someone who had turned down the volume on his own personality in a setting where everyone else had turned theirs up. We also know from the Discovery timeline that the second Primarch was found third in the sequence, around 821 M30. This makes him one of the founding fathers of the Great Crusade in a very real sense. He was there at the beginning, alongside Horus and Leman Russ, fighting in the wars that shaped the Crusade's character when it was still figuring out what it was. He was present for perhaps 80 years of active campaigning before whatever happened to him happened. The novel Fabius Bile, Clone Lord, contains another extraordinary detail. When an expedition of Emperor's children push deep into the eastern fringe and discover the Yimga monolith, a massive Necron structure of unknown purpose, one of the most significant Xenos relics ever encountered, one of the legionnaires mentions something interesting. Fulgrim, apparently, had referred to this place once. The Primarch of the Emperor's children, in one of his rare mentions of the absent brothers, had noted that one of the two Forgotten Ones had led an expedition to the Yimga monolith in the early centuries of the Great Crusade. Based on the Discovery timeline placing the second Primarch among the first 8 found, and given the context of an early expedition deep into the eastern fringe, this is almost certainly the second. He went to the edge of known space. He took his legion into the eastern fringe, beyond the light of the Astronomicon, and into the outer dark, and he investigated one of the most powerful and mysterious Xenos artifacts in the galaxy. What he found there, what he did there, and what effects that expedition may have had on him or his legion are not recorded anywhere. The record at that point simply stops. The expedition went out, and whatever came back from it came back changed in ways that are not described. Then there is the fragment from the Last Council, where Horus stands before a statue and tries to speak a name, Mal, before Malkador's psychic grip stops him. The implications of those syllables are something we will explore in full detail later. But for now, what matters is the emotional content of the scene. Horus is defending the lost Primarch's right to be remembered. He is standing in front of that statue with something close to passion, arguing that the history of what this brother accomplished before his fall deserves to stand alongside the histories of those who did not fall. He is insisting on the reality of this brother's existence and his contributions against the explicit will of the most powerful person left alive who still knows the truth. Horus does not defend everyone this way. He is not known for sentimental loyalty to lost causes. The fact that he makes this specific stand for this specific figure suggests that whatever the second Primarch was to those who knew him, he was worth defending. He mattered in the personal, specific way that people matter to those who knew them rather than just knew of them. And Malkador's response, attacking Horus, personally and with full psychic force, to prevent a name from being spoken, tells us something about the power contained in that name. Names matter in the 40K universe in ways both literal and metaphorical. To name something is to give it reality. To name the second Primarch out loud, in defiance of all the careful forgetting that has been done, would be to reassert his existence against the decision to erase it. Malcador will not allow that. The rage on his face as Horus begins to speak is described as old and familiar. This is not a new anger, not a situational reaction to Horus's defiance. This is an anger that Malcador has carried for a long time, attached to something specific and deeply personal. What we can say with reasonable confidence about the second Primarch is this. He was found early in the Crusade and served as one of its founding figures. He was described by at least one brother as quiet and contemplative, and rarely outspoken. He led his legion on significant operations, including what appears to have been a deep-range expedition to a major Necron site. He suffered some kind of fall or disgrace that led to his being purged from history, and even after that fall, at least one of his brothers believed he deserved to be remembered for what he had accomplished before the end. That last detail is perhaps the most quietly devastating. Even the story of the second Primarch's erasure includes someone who refused, completely and at personal risk, to go along with the forgetting. Someone who stood in front of a statue about to be destroyed and said, "No, this person existed, and that should be acknowledged." The most human impulse in the whole machinery of institutional erasure, the small, stubborn refusal to pretend someone never existed, and it comes from Horus, who would himself become the greatest traitor in history. There is something beautifully ironic in that. The man who would betray the Emperor's dream also refused to betray his memory of a brother the Emperor had decided to forget. Section 5. The 11th Legion, the shameful future. If the second Primarch is the quiet brother whose fall was mourned even by those who knew they should not mourn it, the 11th is a more ambiguous and in some ways darker figure. The evidence we have about the 11th is fewer in number than what we have about the second, but what there is tends toward implications that are more specific and more unsettling. The First Heretic is the novel that yields the most information about both lost Primarchs in a single source. This is the novel about Lorgar and the Word-Bearers, set in the decades before the Horus Heresy, and it contains a conversation between Lorgar and Magnus the Red that touches on the lost Primarchs with unusual directness. Lorgar expresses fear that the Emperor might do to the Word-Bearers what he did to those brothers we no longer speak of. Magnus responds, and what follows reveals several things at once. First, Magnus confirms that the Emperor himself personally made the decision to purge the 2nd and 11th. This was not a decision made by Malcador, or by a council of Primarchs, or by the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium. The Emperor did it, his will, his choice, his action. Second, Magnus reveals that the Emperor had actually considered doing the same thing to Lorgar's word, bearers purging them in the same manner as the 2nd and 11th because of Lorgar's religiosity, his insistence on spreading the worship of the Emperor as a god on every world, the word-bearers conquered. The Emperor found this behavior so contrary to his intentions for the Imperium that he considered the word-bearers an equivalent threat to whatever the 2nd and 11th represented. He was talked out of it by several Primarchs, Leman Russ, Horus, and Magnus himself, with Russ specifically arguing that he did not want to lose a third brother. The implication is profound. In the Emperor's assessment, enthusiastically but unauthorizedly spreading religion was a comparable offense to whatever the 2nd and 11th did. That is either a very high bar for the crimes of the lost Primarchs, or a very concerning statement about how the Emperor weighed the word-bearers' behavior. Third, the novel introduces the phrase that has become the central descriptor for the two absent brothers, the forgotten and the purged. Whether this refers to the two legions separately, one that was forgotten, one that was purged, or is a single phrase applied to both simultaneously, is never clarified. But most importantly for the 11th specifically, the First Heretic contains a vision experienced by the Gal Vorbak, the word-bearers' warriors, who underwent the terrifying transformation of demonic possession that made them the first possessed Space Marines. In this vision, the 11th Primarch is seen in his infancy, before the scattering, before any of the events of the Great Crusade. He is described as innocent and pure. And one of the Gal Vorbak makes a remarkable statement. Killing the 11th Primarch in his infancy would unwrite a shameful future. Argel Tal specifically notes that ending the 11th Primarch's life before he grew up and became what he became would save them a grope, a lot of trouble. Unwrite a shameful future. Save them a lot of trouble. These are not the words you use about someone whose crime was ideological disagreement or even outright rebellion. These are the words you use about someone who did something specific, something concrete, something that had identifiable consequences that affected the people speaking those words. The word-bearers feel that if the 11th Primarch had never grown up, some specific bad outcome would have been avoided. Whatever the 11th Primarch did, the effects of it were felt by people other than himself and his legion. It rippled outward. It caused trouble for others. The novel Wolfsbane adds another dimension. Malcador, speaking to Leman Russ about the Emperor's relationship with his sons, refers to the lost Primarchs as disappointments. That single word is clinical in its coldness, but it carries a specific connotation. Disappointments, not monsters, not traitors, not enemies. People who were expected to be one thing and turned out to be something less. People who failed to live up to what had been hoped for them. The emotional register is almost parental in its particular sadness. The bitterness of someone who invested hope in another person and found that hope unjustified. And then, in the same novel, Russ begins to tell the story of the discovery of the third brother. The conversation cuts off due to warp interference. When it resumes, Russ describes the story as a tragic one. He says nothing else before moving on to other topics, but the word lingers. Tragic. Not shameful, not disgusting, not infuriating tragic. The word that carries within it the acknowledgement that someone deserved better than what they got. The Wolf Time is set in the 41st millennium during the Indomitus Crusade, 10,000 years after the Great Crusade and the Heresy, and it contains the most direct modern reference to the 11th Legion that exists in any published source. 2 members of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, 10,000 warriors who have served and watched over the palace since before the Heresy, are discussing whether the Space Wolves can be trusted to accept their new Primaris reinforcements without resistance. One of them, Hastius Vikellen, makes a comparison to illustrate why the Space Wolves might be suspicious of Guilliman's plans. He says, if Guilliman was to turn on the Emperor, then the Space Wolves would be one of his first opponents. The history of the 10,000 with the 11th Legion is a reminder of that. His companion, Moldovar Colquan, responds, and, as the history you refer to proves more than anything, loyalty to the Emperor can be directed to ill ends by manipulation and lies. These 2 sentences, between them, tell us something extremely specific. The Adeptus Custodes have a direct, personal history with the 11th Legion. Something happened between the Custodes and the 11th that both parties remember, with the Custodes still aware of it 10,000 years later, when most other records of the 11th have been scrubbed. And that something involved the 11th Legion being manipulated and lied to, having their loyalty to the Emperor weaponized against them by someone or something that directed their allegiance toward destructive ends. This is not the story of a Primarch who chose to betray. This is the story of a Primarch who was deceived, who was used, who was turned into a weapon against his own nature through deception, and whose legion paid the ultimate price when the manipulation was discovered and the consequences fell. The distinction between choice and manipulation is the most morally significant element in this entire mystery. Because if the 11th Primarch was manipulated, if he and his legion were moved like pieces by an enemy, using their own loyalty as the mechanism of betrayal, then they are not simply traitors who deserve to be forgotten. They are victims. They are people who trusted the wrong source of information, followed what they believed to be the Emperor's will, and found themselves on the wrong side of an invisible line. And victims, in the Imperium's particular brand of institutional logic, are complicated. They raise questions. They invite sympathy. And sympathy for those who were erased creates cognitive dissonance with the decision to erase them. You can tell a clean story about traitors who chose chaos. It has a beginning, a seduction, a fall, a consequence. The story is legible. But you cannot tell a clean story about people who were innocent and manipulated and then destroyed anyway, because that story has no clean ending. It just has loss. The Codex, Adeptus Custodes, 9th edition, adds one final and deeply suggestive detail to the 11th story. In its description of the dark cells, the deepest and most heavily secured vaults beneath the imperial palace, it mentions among the most sensitive containments held there, something referred to only as subject 11. Whether this is the 11th Primarch in some form of preserved existence, a biological specimen, a psychic imprint, or something else entirely, is not stated. But the number is not a coincidence. The Custodes, who still know the history of the 11th Legion despite 10 millennia of official silence, are guarding something numbered 11 in a place where the most dangerous and sensitive things in the Imperium are kept. Whatever Subject 11 is, it has been there for a very long time, and the Custodes consider it worth keeping. Section 6. The Rangdan Genocides, the war that consumed legions. There is a war lurking in the background of the Great Crusade that most people who are not deep in the lore have never heard of, and Games Workshop has kept it deliberately obscure for many of the same reasons they keep the Lost Primarchs obscure. The Rangdan Genocides are perhaps the most terrible conflict the Imperium faced before the Horus Heresy, and they are also, almost certainly, the historical context in which at least one of the Lost Legions met its end. The Rangda were a xenos species of capabilities that, in the fragmentary records that survive, are described in terms that border on the apocalyptic. When the Great Crusade's expeditionary fleets pushed into the eastern fringe of the galaxy, moving beyond the more familiar reaches of the inner galaxy, and into territory that had been dark and unexplored since the Age of Strife, at least they attracted the attention of the Rangda, and the Rangda did not welcome the attention. What followed was not a war in any conventional sense of measured campaigns and strategic objectives. It was closer to an extinction event, a wave of destruction that came from the galactic north and east simultaneously and threatened to destroy the Imperium before it was even fully constructed. The sources that describe the Rangdan Genocides at all tend to describe them in the vocabulary of catastrophe. Entire expeditionary fleets were annihilated without a single survivor, not defeated, not routed, but simply gone, every ship and every soul lost without a trace. Dozens of Titan legions were obliterated. Whole worlds were burned. The Dark Angels Legion, the First Legion, the most celebrated and most decorated of the Emperor's sons, the pride and the spear point of the entire Great Crusade, suffered losses so severe against the Rangda that they were effectively crippled as a fighting force for years. The novel describing the Space Wolves' involvement in the Genocides, in the Horus Heresy Book 7 Inferno, calls this period the Darkest War. Not the most challenging war, not the most costly, the darkest. The timeline for the Rangdan Genocides is approximately 839 M30 to 890 M30, with different phases and surges of conflict scattered across that 50-year window. The major phase of destruction, when the Rangda attacked from both north and east simultaneously, and the Imperium seemed genuinely likely to lose, occurred in the 860 CES. This is crucial temporal information. The second Primarch was discovered in 821. M30. He was an active Legion commander before the Rangdan threat became existential. The timeline of redacted events in the Forge World Horus Heresy book places two specific redacted incidents involving Space Wolves activity in 965 M30 and 969 M30, which falls after the main Genocides but within the window, when the surviving Rangda were being systematically hunted down and destroyed. Now here is the piece of evidence that connects everything. An official Games Workshop publication embedded in the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, a field guide issued to ordinary soldiers, contained a document described as the Rangdan Genocides, a Crusade field guide, apparently included by mistake in the primer's printing. This document explicitly mentions the 2nd and 11th Legions as having fought alongside Solar Auxilia forces during the Genocides campaign, not the Dark Angels, not the Space Wolves, not the Ultramarines or the Iron Hands, the 2nd, the 11th, two legions that officially do not exist, documented in a war that the Imperium has been trying to keep out of the general record. Their presence in those wars is documented, however accidentally, however parenthetically, in an official source. They fought the Rangda. They were there, in the worst fighting of the early Crusade, in a conflict so terrible that the Dark Angels were crippled and the Death Guard had to conduct emergency recruiting to maintain their numbers. And whatever happened to them, it happened in the context of that war or its immediate aftermath. The Horus Heresy Book 2, Massacre by Forge World, contains a detailed timeline of events in M30 and early M31. Within this timeline, there are entries for the year 965, M230 and 969, M30 that list the participating forces as the Space Wolves and list the event descriptions as all data redacted, not abbreviated, not summarized, not described in general terms. All data redacted, the most complete form of suppression available in an official timeline. 2 events, 4 years apart, both in the same post-Xenocides window, both involving the Space Wolves, both with every detail wiped from the record. 2 events, 2 lost legions. Coincidence would be extraordinary. The shape of what happened, assembled from all these fragments, looks something like this. During the Rangdan Xenocides, a war of such horror and scale that it threatened to end the Imperium before it was fully formed, something happened to the 2nd or 11th legions. The exact nature of what happened is unclear and is perhaps the core of the mystery. Possibilities include corruption by whatever made the Rangda so dangerous, psychological or psychic breakdown from the nature of the combat, deliberate manipulation by an enemy that understood how to turn soldiers against themselves, or simply failure of some fundamental kind that made continued service impossible. But the result was that one or both of these legions became a threat not to the Rangda, but to the Imperium itself, and the Emperor responded by sending in the one force he trusted above all others to do this kind of work. He sent in Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Section 7. The Emperor's Executioner and the Longest Shadow. Of all the Primarchs, Leman Russ of the Space Wolves carries the heaviest burden of implication in the mystery of the Lost Legions. Other Primarchs are connected to the story through grief, through memory, through the shape of what they do not say. Russ is connected through something more specific, more operational. He is connected through what he did. The Space Wolves had a role during the Great Crusade that was distinct from every other legion. Other legions had specialties in the conventional sense. The Ultramarines were administrators and operational planners. The Iron Hands were siege specialists. The Raven Guard were infiltrators and guerrilla fighters. But the Space Wolves had a role that was not discussed openly, and that most people in the Imperium, even within the legions, did not fully understand. They were the Emperor's executioners. When the Emperor had a problem that required military force to be directed at other military force, when brothers needed to be sanctioned, when a legion had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, when the only possible response was the kind of violence that left nothing behind, he sent Russ. This is not fan speculation. This is confirmed by multiple sources at different levels of explicitness. In Prospero Burns, a Space Wolves rune priest explains to an outsider that each Primarch was created with a specific destiny, a wired, in the terminology of Fenrisian culture. Each had a role they were built to fill. Some were builders, some were administrators, some were conquerors. Russ's weird was simple and complete. He was the Emperor's executioner, the tool the Emperor reached for when something needed to end and could not be allowed to not end. This is stated without embarrassment, without shame, without the kind of hedging that would suggest the rune priest is uncomfortable with it. He says it the way you state a fact about physics. The sky is blue, water is wet, Russ is the executioner. And then, in that same novel, the conversation turns to the impending action against Magnus, the Red, and the Thousand Suns, the burning of Prospero, where Russ will lead his legion to destroy his brother's homeworld on the Emperor's orders. The outsider character asks whether Russ is troubled by the unprecedented nature of what is about to happen. Astartes fighting Astartes, Space Marines killing Space Marines, a Primarch being sent to punish another Primarch. And Russ, laughing his characteristic sad laugh, says that this is not unprecedented, that it is, in fact, something he has done before, not the first time. He does not say when, he does not say who. But the implication is stated clearly enough that even the outsider character, who is not a military man, understands what has been said. The Space Wolves have sanctioned another Space Marine Legion before the Thousand Suns, before the heresy. During the Great Crusade, when everything was supposed to be going well, Russ turned his legion against brothers and did what needed to be done, and then the record of it was buried, and he carried the weight of it forward into every subsequent decade and every new conflict. The novel Alfarius, Head of the Hydra, picks up this thread. Alfarius, the master of the Alpha Legion, and arguably the most analytical and intelligence-driven of all the Primarchs, has been building a profile of the Lost Legions for his own reasons. He observes that Leman Russ is the Emperor's executioner. He cross-references the timeline with the pattern of Space Wolves' deployment. He considers the two redacted events, and he concludes, noting that he has no direct evidence, but treating the logical inference as convincing that Russ is likely responsible for at least one of the two unknown Primarchs' disappearances. He treats this not as speculation, but as the most probable conclusion given the available information. Later in that same novel, when Alfarius and Omegon are together, and Alfarius is telling his brother everything he has learned and deduced about the galaxy's various mysteries, he begins to tell Omegon what he knows about the 11th Legion. He starts the sentence. He begins to share his analysis, and then they are interrupted violently, immediately, by an external force, and the conversation never resumes. The narrative cuts away and never comes back to what Alfarius was about to say. This is a technique used throughout the Lost Primarchs lore, with notable consistency, characters beginning to say things and being stopped before they finish. Horus throttled before a name escapes his lips. Russ cut off by warp interference before a story is completed. Alfarius interrupted before his analysis can be shared. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. These are authorial choices, deliberate narrative decisions to gesture at something without stating it, to create the shape of a secret without filling in its content. The Forge World timeline entries for 965, M30 and 969, M30, both redacted, both with Space Wolves' participation. These are the most concrete physical evidence of the Space Wolves' role in ending the Lost Legions. Two separate events, 4 years apart. Two legions, each requiring a separate operation. The Space Wolves did not simply arrive once and handle everything. There were two distinct actions, 4 years apart, each one significant enough to be entered in the timeline and specific enough to require complete data suppression. What that suppression hides is the question. Did Russ fight a war against the Second Legion, achieve victory, then 4 years later face the 11th? Did the two operations overlap and the second was cleanup from the first? Were both actions against a single legion that had spread across multiple systems and required years of pursuit? The timeline does not say, because the timeline has been made deliberately incapable of saying. There is also a thread in Wolfsbane where Russ, speaking about the discovery of Primarchs, mentions his first meeting with the third brother, which, based on the discovery timeline, would be the second Primarch. The warp cuts the conversation off. When it resumes, Russ says it was a tragic tale. Then he mentions that Ferrus Manus was found next, and he moves on. Consider what is embedded in that sequence. Russ describes the third brother as someone he remembers, whose story he was willing to tell, whose discovery was a moment in his personal history worth recounting. He found this memory accessible enough to begin telling. And then the story cuts away, and when it resumes, the brother is gone from the conversation, not referred to, not mentioned, not even dismissed, simply absent from the narrative, as if the current that carried them there also carried them away. And the word he used, tragic, sits there like a stone in still water, sending out ripples that never fully settle. The Space Wolves were the instrument, but the grief in their voices when they speak about it suggests they were not a willing instrument. They did what was required, they did what the Emperor needed, and they carried the weight of it forward into every decade of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy and the 10,000 years that followed, unable to talk about it, unable to admit it, carrying a shame that they could not articulate because the act itself had been sealed away from the record. Section 8. The Chamber at the End of Memory. Dorn's Revelation. If there is one piece of lore that assembles the scattered fragments into something approaching a coherent picture, it is the short story, The Chamber at the End of Memory. This story is not long. It is a contained narrative set during the fortification of the imperial palace in the period leading up to the Horus Heresy. But what it reveals about the mechanics of the cover-up, the depth of the suppression, and the true nature of what was lost is extraordinary. During the massive engineering work of hardening the palace against an anticipated assault work being overseen by Rogal Dorn, who has been placed in charge of the defenses, a work crew is assigned to seal up and reinforce sections of the palace's older architecture. In the course of their work, they break into a tower that was not on any of the plans they were given. They trigger psychic traps that have been lying dormant in the tower's walls for years. They die, every single one of them, killed by wards designed to kill anyone who entered without authorization. Rogal Dorn is called to investigate. He descends into the tower and finds something that stops him with the force of something between recognition and confusion. 2 doors, set into the walls of a sealed corridor. Each door is marked with a numeral. The numeral 2, the numeral 11. Dorn knows, at some level beneath conscious articulation, what these numbers mean. He reaches for the knowledge and finds it there, not as a clear memory, but as a certainty, without content, a conviction, without supporting detail. These are the personal quarters of the 2 absent brothers. He is standing in the place where they once had rooms in the palace. But these rooms are in the wrong part of the palace they should be, logically, in a different wing, where he knows the Primarchs' quarters to be. The existence of these rooms, here, in this hidden tower with its lethal traps, is wrong in ways he cannot fully process. Then Malkador appears. The Sigillite, who has been managing the secrets of the palace and the Empire for longer than most of the Primarchs have been alive, confronts Dorn in the manner of someone who has been expecting this particular discovery and has been dreading it. And he begins to tell Dorn things that Dorn himself was responsible for setting in motion, but has been made to forget. The memory block on the lost Primarchs, the comprehensive, systematic suppression of knowledge about the 2nd and 11th, was not imposed from above, not an edict from the Emperor thrust upon reluctant sons. It was requested by Dorn and by Robut Guilliman. These 2 Primarchs, the most rational and pragmatic of the 20, made a calculated decision after whatever happened to the 2nd and 11th. They decided that the information was too dangerous to leave in circulation, not just for ordinary people, for everyone, including themselves. They went to Malkador and asked him to remove from their own minds, and from the minds of all their brothers, the full and specific knowledge of what had occurred. Every non-Primarch who had ever directly interacted with the lost Primarchs was mind-wiped entirely. People who had served alongside them, who had known their names, who had eaten meals with them, or fought beside them, or reported to them. All of them had the memories of those interactions removed with psychic thoroughness that left no trace. The Space Marines of the Lost Legions were not executed. They were given the same treatment, mind-wiped of their specific memories of their gene fathers, and then reintegrated into other legions where they would continue to serve, their history edited out of them, their sense of themselves as members of Legions 2 and 11, replaced with new identities in new institutions. This was presented, Malkador says, as mercy. The soldiers had not sinned. The soldiers did not deserve to die for what their Primarchs had done. And so the soldiers were preserved, repurposed, given new beginnings. Even the Primarchs, who had personally known the 2nd and 11th, a small number, most Primarchs never met them, had their memories altered. Not completely removed, because the complete removal of memory from a Primarch's mind would have been noticed, and would have left a Primarch functionally impaired in ways that would have been obvious. Instead, the memories were blurred. The names were specifically suppressed. What remained was the faintest impression, the sense of a presence that had once been there, a sibling whose face could not quite be recalled, a voice that was familiar but impossible to place, enough to know that brothers had existed, not enough to know their names or their crimes. Dorn, being told this, realizes with escalating horror that he requested this be done to himself. He chose to forget. He decided, in his calculated architectural way, that the knowledge was a structural weakness, a point of vulnerability that could not be secured as long as it existed as memory, and so he had it removed. And then he forgot that he had had it removed. Malkador decides, in the circumstances of this specific meeting, to temporarily restore Dorn's memories, to let him remember, just for a moment, what he once knew and chose to bury. We are not shown the content of that restoration. The narrative very deliberately does not describe what Dorn sees when his memories return. We do not learn the names. We do not learn exactly what happened. The story holds back from the revelation with a discipline that feels almost perverse in its consistency with the mystery it maintains. But we are shown Dorn's reaction. We are told what he says once the memories are in him again. He says, "What came to pass could overshadow everything. The raw, hateful truth is clear to me. If they were here with us now, this war would already have been lost. If the 2nd and 11th Primarchs had been present for the Horus heresy, the war would have been lost. Not might have been more difficult, not could have gone differently, would already have been lost. The tense is past for a war still in progress. The certainty is absolute. If they were here in any form, with any allegiance, present in the galaxy during the conflict, the Imperium falls. What could that possibly mean? What kind of threat requires 2 Primarchs to already be dead, not captured, not imprisoned, not neutralized, but gone from the record entirely before the heresy even begins, in order for the surviving side to have any hope of winning? The answer to that question is the center of the mystery, the thing that Malcador will not say, and Dorn cannot hold in his mind for long before it fades again. What we can say is that it is not a normal military threat. The traitor Primarchs, Horus, Fulgrim, Mortarion, Angron, all of them were present during the heresy and the Imperium, survived, barely and at enormous cost, but survived. None of the known traitor Primarchs, individually or collectively, generated the kind of certainty that Dorn expresses here. Whatever the 2nd and 11th were capable of, or whatever state they had reached, was categorically more dangerous than everything the heresy actually produced. The story ends with the memories beginning to fade from Dorn's mind. He gives the order for the tower to be buried, sealed permanently, removed from all maps. Only a tomb now, he says, as the last of the restored memory dissolves and he returns to the comfortable, sustainable blankness that Malcador carefully reinstated years before. 2 absent brothers, 2 sealed doors, 1 Primarch standing in a hidden room with the weight of a truth he cannot hold, about to forget again the reasons why he built the wall of silence he is standing inside. It is the most complete image of what it costs to maintain a secret this large. You do not just bury the information, you bury your own capacity to access it. You build a forgetting so thorough that the forgetting itself becomes invisible. The most comprehensive cover-up is the one where even the architects do not remember building it. Section 9. The name, almost spoken Malcador's rage. The scene in the Last Council deserves its own sustained attention, because it is the moment when the mystery comes closest to resolving itself, and the manner in which it stops short of resolution is itself enormously revealing. The setup is unusual. Horus, Alpharius, and Jagatai Khan, an unlikely alliance, since these 3 are not typically depicted as particularly close, discover Malcador in the act of destroying a statue, not ordering workers to remove it, not signing a paperwork order for its disposition. Malcador the Sigillite, the most powerful human psyker alive, personally doing the physical work of dismantling a likeness of one of the Emperor's sons. The choice to destroy the statue himself speaks to the personal, emotional character of Malcador's relationship with whatever the statue represents. This is not bureaucratic record-keeping. This is not even political necessity carried out at arm's length. This is an old man who has decided, with his own hands, to remove from the world the physical image of someone whose memory he cannot afford to leave standing. The destruction is intimate and deliberate and, in the way all intimate and deliberate destructions are, contains within it a history of pain. Horus stops him. He plants himself in front of the statue with a resolve that is specifically not the resolve he usually brings to military or political situations. This is personal. And the argument that follows between Horus and Malcador is one of the most genuine intellectual disagreements in the entire Horus Heresy series, because both of them are right from within their own frameworks. Horus's argument is fundamentally about historical integrity. You cannot edit greatness out of existence because it ended badly. This Primarch, the absent brother whose face is on this statue, did real things. He achieved real victories. He served the Emperor in ways that were genuine and significant. His story has a fall, yes, but it also has a before the fall, and that before the fall deserves to stand. The statue is not just a representation of the fallen brother, it is evidence of what a son of the Emperor can be before he breaks, and erasing it erases not just the man, but the possibility of what he represented. Malcador's argument is about the cost of knowledge, about the practical reality that some truths are more dangerous than useful. The statue raises questions. Questions lead to investigation. Investigation leads to knowledge. And this particular knowledge, the full truth of what happened to the two absent brothers, the real reason for the empty plinths, would do damage that outweighs any benefit of historical completeness. Malcador is not arguing that the lost Primarch was evil and deserves no memorial. He is arguing that the memorial itself is a security threat. They are both right. That is what makes the scene so good, and so characteristically 40K in its moral texture. The argument escalates. Horus pushes past the point where Malcador will simply continue to argue, and he begins to speak the lost Primarch's name. He is going to say it, out loud. In the open air of the Imperial Palace, in defiance of every prohibition that has been layered over this subject, he is going to assert the reality of this brother by the simple act of naming him. And Malcador turns on him with the full force of his psychic power. Horus the War Master, the greatest Primarch by general consensus, a being of superhuman physical and psychic capability, is put on his knees. His windpipe is closed. The force being applied to him is not the calibrated precision of someone making a point. It is the raw, overwhelming force of someone acting from rage. From that specific rage Malcador has been carrying for a long time, described as old and familiar, not a new anger sparked by the current situation, but a pre-existing fire that gets stirred when certain buttons are pushed. Horus, being strangled, will not stop trying. He keeps trying to get the name out, even as his oxygen cuts off, even as a blood vessel bursts in his eye from the pressure. All that escapes is Mal-Al. 3 syllables, forced out against impossible resistance, before the grip closes completely and the attempt fails. The fandom has spent years arguing about what those syllables mean. The most conservative interpretation is that Horus was trying to say Malcador, calling Malcador by name, perhaps in an attempt to break through the violence of the moment by direct address. But this interpretation has several problems. First, Horus was already speaking before Malcador attacked him. He was in the middle of saying the lost Primarch's name when the attack came, suggesting the name begins with M. Second, Malcador's reaction of old, familiar rage makes much more sense if the syllables being forced out are the beginning of the lost Primarch's name than if Horus was simply saying his own attacker's name in protest. The rage is described as surfacing specifically because of what Horus is trying to say, and saying Malcador to Malcador would not generate that reaction from him. The third syllable, al, is where the theory gets most interesting. M-mal, al, forms the beginning of a name that sounds like Malal. In the oldest versions of Warhammer mythology, Malal, also called Malice in some sources, was a 5th chaos god, a deity of paradox and self-destruction, the power that turned against all the other powers, including itself. Malal was removed from official Games Workshop lore in the early editions, the rights to the name becoming legally complicated. But the concept has never entirely gone away, and references to the idea of a self-opposing force within the Chaos Pantheon persist in various forms. If a Primarch's name began with those syllables, and if that Primarch had some connection to the concept of Malal, the implications for what that Primarch represented, and why his very name is a threat worth choking someone over, begin to crystallize into something coherent. A Primarch of paradox and self-opposition would not fit neatly into either side of the heresy. He would not serve the Emperor, and he would not serve chaos. He would represent a third option, a force outside the existing framework, unpredictable, in ways that make him more dangerous than either loyal or traitor, because you cannot plan against someone who does not follow the logic of either position, and that a force that operates outside the binaries of loyalty and chaos, order and rebellion, is exactly the kind of thing that Rogel Dorn might have meant when he said the war would already be lost if the two absent brothers were present, not because they would fight for Horus, because they would fight for something else, something that follows its own rules, something that neither side could predict or control. This is speculation, built on 3 syllables forced from a strangled throat. It may be nothing more than coincidence and fan wishful thinking, but Games Workshop chose those syllables deliberately, in a moment of deliberate narrative weight, at a point where a much simpler choice, just have Horus start to say, Malcador would have served the scene equally well without adding all this dense atmosphere of barely suppressed revelation. They chose M, Mal, Al, and then they stopped. Section 10. What happened to the soldiers, the mind wipe, and the dispersal? One of the most practically interesting and most philosophically troubling aspects of the Lost Legion story is a question that is easy to lose in the larger mystery. What happened to the actual Space Marines? Not the Primarchs, whose fates, whatever they were clearly definitive, but the rank and file, the tens of thousands of warriors who served in the 2nd and 11th Legions, who spent their enhanced lives training and fighting and bleeding for the Great Crusade, who had nothing to do with whatever their gene fathers did or had done to them. The chamber at the end of memory answers this, and the answer is revealing in ways that speak directly to the question of where fault was assigned. The Space Marines of the 2 Lost Legions did not share their Primarchs' fates. They were not executed. They were not imprisoned in the dark cells beneath the palace. They were preserved. They were mind-wiped, specifically and systematically stripped of their memories of their gene fathers, their Legion identities, their understanding of themselves as members of Legions 2 and 11, and then they were reintegrated into other legions. Given new identities, put back into the service of the Imperium in different formations, under different banners, with no memory of what they had once been. Malcador says this was done at the request of Dorn and Guilliman. The 2 most pragmatic of the Primarchs looked at these thousands of skilled, trained, experienced Space Marines warriors who had done nothing personally to earn death or condemnation, and decided that the waste of executing them was unjustifiable. The soldiers had not committed the crime. The crime, whatever it was, resided with their Primarchs, and so the soldiers were shown the mercy of a second beginning, at the cost of having their first beginning removed from their own minds. Malcador describes this as mercy, and perhaps it was, in the cold utilitarian framework that the Imperium tends to apply to such decisions. These warriors kept their lives. They kept their skills and their capabilities. They kept everything that made them Space Marines. They simply lost their names and their origins and their brothers and the specific memories that would have told them who they were, which is either a small price or an enormous one, depending on how you weigh identity against existence. The question that naturally follows is, where did they go? Which legions absorbed the mind-wipe survivors of the 2nd and 11th? The novel, The First Heretic, provides what appears to be an intentionally vague answer. A rumor is mentioned, described specifically as a rumor, something the characters discussing it treat with skepticism, that the Ultramarines Legion grew dramatically in size, around the time that the 2nd and 11th were expunged. The implication of the rumor is that the survivors of the Lost Legions were integrated into the Ultramarines, which would explain how Guilliman's Legion became, by a significant margin, the largest Space Marine force in existence, large enough to eclipse all other legions combined. One character dismisses this as insipid conjecture. That phrase is interesting, because it is a very specific and somewhat aggressive dismissal for what is presented as casual speculation. When characters in Warhammer 40,000 lore dismiss things too forcefully, it is often because the thing being dismissed is uncomfortably close to the truth. The vehemence of the denial is itself a kind of evidence. What makes the Ultramarines connection particularly fascinating is what it would mean for the genetic legacy of the Lost Legions. If survivors of the 2nd and 11th were integrated into the Ultramarines, they would have carried with them their original gene seed, the genetic material derived from their specific Primarchs. That gene seed would have been in those warriors, fighting in every campaign, present at the Siege of Terra, surviving the heresy and its aftermath. When the Second Founding broke the legions into chapters, the warriors carrying that original gene seed would have been distributed into the successor chapters of the Ultramarines. It would have been impossible, in the chaos of mind wipes and reassignments, and the general disruption of the Great Crusade's final years, to identify and remove every carrier. The Lost Primarchs' genetic legacy may be present right now in Space Marine chapters that have no idea whose sons they partially are. Chapters that trace their lineage to Guilliman but carry, somewhere in the complex mixture of their gene seed, something older and stranger, the biological inheritance of Primarchs, whose names cannot be spoken. Belisarius Cawl, who has been working on the Primaris Space Marine project for 10,000 years, and who collected genetic samples from all 20 original Primarchs as part of that work, would know exactly what that mixed inheritance looks like. He would have the data to identify which modern chapters carry traces of the lost Primarchs' genes. When Guilliman forbids him from putting the lost gene lines into production, Call's inferior responds pointedly, almost defensively, that the warriors were not at fault. The science is not at fault. Their Primarchs were. This is not just a reference to the gene seed of the traitor Primarchs, which Call has also collected. This specifically defends the quality and usability of the lost Primarchs' genetic material, as if anticipating an objection to that specific suggestion. Call knows the lost Primarchs' gene lines are not inherently contaminated. He knows the problem, whatever it was personal to the Primarchs themselves and does not live in their genetics. And he is quietly, in his mechanical way, making the argument for using that gene seed anyway, an argument Guilliman is not yet willing to accept, but one that Call appears confident he will eventually make compelling. 10,000 years of carefully maintained silence, and the most eccentric mechanical mind in the Imperium is already working on reopening the conversation. Section 11. Modern Echoes, Subject 11, Call, and the 41st Millennium. The story of the lost Primarchs did not end in the Great Crusade. It has been leaving traces for 10,000 years, appearing in places and in ways that are easy to miss individually, but form a pattern when you see them together. The mystery is not a closed book. It has been quietly building towards something, and the breadcrumbs in the modern 41st Millennium lore are among the freshest and most intriguing. Subject 11. The phrase appears in Codex, Adeptus Custodes, 9th edition, in a passage describing the deepest and most heavily secured vaults beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. These are the dark cells, not the fortified garrisons and archives of the palace's upper levels, but the truly inaccessible depths, the places where things are kept that the Imperium has decided must never see light again. In this list of contents, mentioned in passing among other extraordinary things, is an entity or object referred to only as Subject 11. The numbering is not a coincidence. In a setting where the numbering of legions and Primarchs carries enormous symbolic and historical weight, and where the 11th Legion is one of the most sensitive topics in the Imperium's entire institutional memory, a thing called Subject 11, held in the deepest cells of the palace during the 41st Millennium, is a gravitational implication. It pulls toward one conclusion, even as the text refuses to confirm it. The Adeptus Custodes know about the 11th Legion. The Wolftime established this explicitly. 2 Custodes in the modern era casually reference the Custodes' history with the 11th Legion as a known thing, as a past event that both parties understand without elaboration. They remember. They have maintained their knowledge of the 11th's history through 10,000 years of official silence. They are not bound by the mind wipes that were applied to Space Marines or by the Damnatio Memoriae that was applied to all public records. If something labeled Subject 11 is in the dark cells, the Custodes put it there, or they received it there and have maintained it there. Either way, they know what it is. And the fact that they have maintained its containment rather than destroying it means they consider its continued existence either necessary or too dangerous to risk destroying. What could Subject 11 be? The most dramatic possibility is the 11th Primarch themselves, held in some form of stasis or containment, alive or preserved, or simply existing in a state that is neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense, in a vault beneath the palace for 10,000 years. This would imply that the 11th Primarch could not simply be killed, that something about their nature, their powers, or the circumstances of their situation made death insufficient or impossible or inadvisable. Subject 11, then, becomes the Imperium's longest-running and most secret containment operation, a being so dangerous, so categorically problematic, that 10 millennia of the most heavily armed guards in human history have been assigned to keep them sealed in the dark. But there are other possibilities. Subject 11 could be a biological specimen genoseed, blood samples, tissue preserved for study or for containment of the gene line. It could be a psychic artifact associated with the Primarch. It could be something the Primarch created or discovered that carries their influence in some lasting way. The Codex does not specify. It simply states that this thing exists, that it is in the dark cells, and that the custodes are aware of it. In Belisarius' Call, the Great Work, the team exploring the Pharos beacon on the planet Sotha encounters a dimensional mirror, an ancient Xenos artifact capable of reflecting alternate possibilities, versions of reality that could have existed if circumstances had been different. What they see in the mirror, in the possible reality it shows, includes approximately 20 warriors in gray armor, where one of the existing characters would otherwise have stood. 3 of these gray-armored figures approach the mirror, then 2 more who manifest psychic powers. They are unidentified. They wear the gray of blank placeholders, of unknown categories, of possibilities that were never fulfilled. This scene has no definitive interpretation that Games Workshop has confirmed, but the imagery is deliberate. Gray silhouettes are what the Lost Legions are represented by in official art books stamped classified or censored, depicted in the absence of color that marks them as things that cannot be given visual identity. 20 gray figures in a dimensional mirror that shows alternate possibilities in the middle of a story about Call and the past of the Primaris project feels like a careful, authorial choice. Here, reflected in a glass, is the universe where the lost Primarchs did not have to be lost, where all 20 suns stood. Robert Guillemin, in the revised 2021 edition of Dark Imperium, speaks to a priest and quietly corrects the church's mythology. 20, not 18, 2 failed. And then, in his private reflections, he characterizes this as more hidden information, more deliberate concealment, more deliberate mythology constructed over truth. He says it with a tiredness that suggests someone who has been carrying this awareness for 10,000 years. The awareness that the story people tell about the Imperium is not the story of the Imperium, that the foundations are not what the structure claims they are. Guillemin is the last of the major Primarchs, who was part of the decision to erase the Lost Legions, who helped design the suppression, and who chose to have his own memories altered. He carries all of it. He is, in the 41st millennium, the single surviving point of connection between the current Imperium and the buried truth of what the Great Crusade actually was and what it actually cost. And he is rebuilding the Imperium with that knowledge, all of it, the parts people know and the parts they do not in his mind. Attempting, perhaps for the second time in 10,000 years, to build something worthy of what was sacrificed to make it possible. Section 12. Why Games Workshop will never tell us, and why that is exactly right. This final section requires stepping outside the lore itself and thinking about why this mystery exists at all, why it has been maintained for nearly 4 decades, and why, despite every commercial incentive and every fan-pleading Games Workshop, has consistently chosen to leave it unresolved. Rick Priestley, who created the original framework for Warhammer 40,000 in the late 1980s, was asked directly why he put 2 missing legions in the lore. His answer was pragmatic. He created them as blank spaces for players to fill with their own homebrewed content. If you wanted to create your own Space Marine chapter with a unique Primarch and backstory that fit into the official history, you could slot them into Legion 2 or 11 and have an in-universe framework to support your creation. The blank numbers were an invitation, come in, make something, make it yours, make it fit. That original design intent, however, has been dramatically outgrown by what followed. In the decades since Priestley's statement, dozens of authors have added specific, often individually contradictory, but collectively consistent layers of implication to the mystery. The fragments we have been discussing today are not random creative accidents. They are deliberate contributions to a sustained, coordinated piece of narrative design, not a single story moving toward a conclusion, but an atmosphere being carefully maintained. The void is not empty. It has been precisely shaped. Games Workshop has maintained the rule, in every era of the game's development, that the Lost Primarchs' names and fates will never be officially confirmed. This is unusual for a company that has been willing to resolve other long-standing mysteries, that has brought Primarchs back from apparent death, that has advanced the setting timeline by nearly 1,000 years, that has killed gods and elevated mortals, and done everything else that seemed undoable. But the 2nd and 11th remain sealed. Every opportunity to open that door has been seen by the writers and editors involved in the decision, and they have kept walking. The reason is structural, and it is articulated with perfect elegance within the lore itself, through the chamber at the end of memory. Some secrets are more valuable kept than known. Within the fiction, the knowledge of what happened to the lost Primarchs is buried because revealing it would threaten everything built on top of it. Within the real world of game design and creative property management, the mystery is kept alive because it serves a function that a revelation could not serve. A revealed lost Primarch is a solved problem. A permanent lost Primarch is an open door. Every time a new author drops a new fragment, every time a fan theory gains traction in the community, every time someone rereads the chamber at the end of memory and notices something they missed before, the lost Primarchs become more present in the community, not less. The mystery generates engagement, real, sustained, passionate engagement of the kind that no specific answer could sustain. If the second Primarch's name were officially confirmed tomorrow, there would be a week of discussion, and then it would be settled, knowledge, filed away, referenced occasionally, no longer generating new thought. The blank space, by contrast, has been generating new thought for 4 decades and shows no sign of stopping. The lost Primarchs also carry thematic weight that is inseparable from their being unknown. Warhammer 40,000 is a universe where the official history is almost always a lie, where the most important events are also the most carefully suppressed, where the institutions that claim to protect humanity are often the ones doing the most systematic damage to it. The Imperium runs on controlled information on myth and propaganda, and the strategic deployment of ignorance as a tool of social control. The lost Primarchs are not just a mystery. They are a structural demonstration of that principle, built into the bones of the setting's history at the very foundation. The fact that the erasure succeeded, mostly, for 10,000 years, that even most Space Marines do not know the 2nd and 11th existed, that the Church does not count them, that ordinary citizens of the Imperium have no concept that there were 20 suns rather than 18, is itself a statement about the Imperium's capacity for institutional amnesia. They did not just erase 2 people. They erased the category of people who might have been erased. They made the erasure invisible by making it complete. And the few traces that remain, the empty plinths, the blacked-out lines, Sanguinius's terror, Vulcan's grief, Dorn forgetting that he chose to forget, these are not failures of the cover-up, they are its texture. The cover-up is so complete that the only thing left visible is the shape of what was covered, the silhouette, not the substance, the outline, not the face. That is, in the end, what the lost Primarchs are. They are the most visible example of something invisible. They are the proof that the Imperium can make you disappear so completely that the disappearance becomes part of the landscape, unremarkable. Just another feature of a universe full of things that are not what they seem. They are the shape of a secret so large that even those who kept it eventually stopped remembering that they were keeping it. 2 sons, 20 went out and 18 came home. 2 were erased from stone and record and memory, buried so deep that even their brothers forgot their names. And yet, the empty plinths are still there. Dorn noticed them. Sanguinius feared the 3rd. Vulcan grieved the 2. Guilliman remembers the number. Call has the gene data. Someone has been maintaining the containment of Subject 11 for 10,000 years. Leman Russ called the story of the 3rd brother a tragic one, and then could not finish telling it. You cannot truly erase a son of the Emperor. Not completely. Not from everything. The numbers remain. 2 plinths sit empty in a corridor of the palace. 2 black bars cover names in a Forge World rulebook. A short story exists about 2 sealed doors in a tower that should not be there. And somewhere in the dark beneath the Imperial Palace, in a vault that even the golden warriors who guard it speak of in careful, measured tones, Subject 11 waits. The mystery is the message. The message is this: there were 20 sons, and the Imperium will never tell you what happened to 2 of them. But we can follow the breadcrumbs. We can sit with the fragments and let the pattern emerge. We can stand at the edge of the void left by their erasure and feel the shape of it. And sometimes, if you look long enough at what is not there, you begin to understand what was. That is the full picture of what we know, what we can reasonably infer, and what we can only wonder about when it comes to the 2 lost Primarchs of Warhammer 40,000. Every piece of evidence has been examined. Every thread has been followed as far as it will go. Every fragment of text that gestures toward the void has been held up to the light. The mystery remains. That is by design. And that is, if you can appreciate it for what it is, exactly as it should be. If this kind of exhaustive, unhurried exploration of Warhammer 40,000 lore is what you are here for, then subscribing is genuinely the best thing you can do. We go this deep every single time. Every topic we cover, we follow to the end of whatever thread exists to follow, no matter how long it takes. Click the subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And if you have a theory about the Lost Primarchs, if you think you know who they were, what they did, what Subject 11 really is, or what those 3 syllables Horus was trying to say, actually spell out, write it in the comments. I read everything, and this community has some of the sharpest minds in the fandom. The mystery is alive. The community keeps it breathing. See you in the next one. End of script. Bonus section. The broader implications. What the Lost Primarchs tell us about the Emperor. Everything we have examined so far has been about the 2nd and 11th Primarchs themselves, their personalities, their fates, the mechanics of their erasure, and the emotional aftermath of their disappearance. But there is a perspective we have not yet fully explored, and it is in some ways the most important one. What does the existence and erasure of the Lost Primarchs tell us about the Emperor himself? Because everything that happened to the 2nd and 11th ultimately traces back to one decision made by one being. The Emperor created these sons. The Emperor found them after the scattering. The Emperor incorporated them into his great crusade. And when they failed, in whatever way they failed, for whatever reason, the Emperor was the one who decided what to do about it. Not Malcador, who implemented the erasure. Not Dorn and Gilliman, who requested the memory blocks. Not Lehman Russ, who was the instrument. The Emperor decided to erase his sons from history. That decision, and what it means about the Emperor as a figure and as a father, is perhaps the darkest implication in the entire Lost Primarchs mystery. Because it tells us that the Emperor's commitment to the Imperium superseded his commitment to his children. When the two came into conflict, when a son's existence became a threat to the project, the son was removed, without, as far as we can tell from any source, any recorded hesitation or public grief or acknowledgement of loss. The Emperor wept, almost certainly. The bleak sorrow on his face when Korax asked about the missing brothers is the evidence of that. But he wept privately, if at all, and moved on. He continued the crusade. He continued building the Imperium. He used his other sons without apparently being paralyzed by what he had done to these two. The project was too important to allow a failure to compromise it, and if the failure was the sons themselves, then the sons were the cost of continuing the project. This is a profoundly uncomfortable portrait of the being that the Imperium worships as a god, the Emperor of mankind, father of the Primarchs, light of the galaxy. He erased his children when they became inconvenient. He did not warn them. He did not rehabilitate them. He did not give them second chances in some secure location where their flaws could be managed. He ended them, buried the evidence, and continued walking. The Primarch Angron. The Red Angel contains a character who explicitly wishes the Emperor had done the same thing to Angron when it became clear how damaged the gladiatorial combat chips in his brain had made him. The argument is essentially utilitarian. The Emperor should have looked at Angron, recognized a broken tool, and disposed of it before it could hurt people. The character is speaking in frustration after the catastrophic damage Angron has caused, but the logic is the Emperor's own logic, applied explicitly. What makes the character's wish significant in the context of the Lost Primarchs is that it confirms this is understood, within the setting, as something the Emperor is capable of. The Lost Primarchs are not a mystery, because the Emperor's willingness to remove failed sons is unthinkable. They are a mystery, because the specific failure that triggered this response is unknown. The Emperor's capability for this kind of decisive ruthlessness is established fact, referenced openly. What is hidden is not the act, but the reason. Dark Imperium and its conversations between Guilliman and the Frater Mathieu give us another angle on this. When Guilliman corrects the priest's mythology, telling him there were 20 Primarchs, not 18, and that 2 failed, he frames their failure in language that is notably distinct from how he describes the traitors. The traitors are discussed elsewhere in that novel with specific emotional weight, the bitterness of betrayal, the grief of lost brothers who chose the wrong path. But when Gilliman mentions the two who failed, his language is different, cooler, more abstract. As if these two are not quite in the same category of relationship, not brothers who betrayed him, but brothers who simply were not, who passed through the story and left it, without the narrative weight of choosing betrayal. This abstraction might be a product of the memory blocks Gilliman knows intellectually that they existed and failed, but the specific emotional content of having known them, having fought alongside them, having regarded them as real people with real personalities, has been largely removed. What remains is the fact without the feeling, and that is perhaps the most complete kind of erasure. Not just removing the memory, but removing the emotional anchoring that would make the memory feel personal. But underneath the abstraction, the implication stands. The Emperor created 20 sons, and 2 of them failed in some way that led to their removal from the record. And the Primarchs who remained, the 18 who went on to fight the Crusade, and then the heresy, did so in the shadow of that knowledge. They knew, even with their memories suppressed, that failure was possible, that Primarchs were not guaranteed, that the Emperor's love, if it could be called that, was conditional on usefulness. Sanguinius's terror at the empty plinths is the most direct articulation of this understanding. He looks at the 2 absent brothers and sees a precedent, a possibility, not a cautionary tale, but a template. They were removed because something was wrong with them. The red thirst is wrong with the Blood Angels. The connection is not stated, but it is felt. With all the clarity that a being of Sanguinius's remarkable emotional intelligence can bring to bear on a problem. The gap between the Blood Angels and the empty plinths is the distance between discovery and decision. If the Emperor looked at the Blood Angels the same way he looked at the absent brothers, how long before the decision came? This is the world the Primarchs inhabit. Superhuman in body, psychically overwhelming, tactically brilliant, individually capable of turning the tide of battles that would otherwise kill 10,000 ordinary soldiers, and still capable of being erased if the Emperor decided they were not worth keeping. The fragility this creates, the specific kind of vulnerability that comes from knowing your creator can simply remove you, is part of what defines the tragedy of the Primarchs as a group, not just the tragedy of the 2 who were lost. The tragedy of the 18 who had to keep going with that knowledge hanging over them. The Emperor never acknowledged this publicly. He never said to his remaining sons, "I removed 2 of your brothers. Here is why. Here is what you can learn from it." He simply continued, and expected them to continue, and left the knowledge of what he had done to sit in the back of their minds like a splinter that no one could remove because no one was allowed to acknowledge it was there. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the gods are capable of loss. Even the most powerful being in the galaxy was unable to save 2 of the things he made, and he chose deliberately, calculatedly, to bury that failure so completely that even the memory of it became a kind of casualty. The forgetting was not just about protecting the Imperium from dangerous knowledge. It was also, perhaps, about protecting the Emperor from the weight of having failed his sons, from having to look at the evidence of his own fallibility every time someone asked about the empty plinths. The chamber at the end of memory is also, in this reading, a chamber at the end of the Emperor's perfect narrative of himself as the infallible father-creator. The 2 sealed doors marked 2 and 11 are the doors he cannot open without admitting what lies behind them. Final section. The theories assembled. What do we actually believe happened? After all of this, the fragments examined, the threads followed, the implications considered, it is worth attempting the synthesis that the official lore will never provide. Not as fact, but as the most coherent reading of the available evidence. The theory that, if forced to commit to a position, a serious student of the lore might defend as most likely to be close to whatever the actual creative intent behind the mystery is. The most defensible reading of the evidence, taken as a whole, goes something like this. The second Primarch was found 3rd in the sequence of discoveries, early in the Great Crusade. He was a quiet, contemplative, humorless person who led his legion effectively and operated in the outer reaches of the galaxy, including an expedition to the Yimga monolith, a powerful Necron artifact in the deep eastern fringe. Whatever he found there, or whatever exposure to the Necron's reality-warping technology and the deep warp energies of the Eastern Fringe did to him, either began or accelerated a change in the second Primarch or his legion that was eventually recognized as unacceptably dangerous. This change may have been a gene seed mutation, a psychic corruption, a philosophical radicalization, or simply the development of capabilities or inclinations that the Emperor had not anticipated and could not accommodate. The second Primarch was described by Fulgrim as having spoken against him as someone who had opinions and was willing to express them when he felt the cause warranted it. Whatever he became, or whatever he did, Horus believed it deserved to be remembered rather than erased, which implies it was not straightforward villainy. It was something more complicated, something that even from the outside could be seen as having its own internal logic, however dangerous that logic might be. The 11th Primarch was found much later, near the end of the Great Crusade's timeline, as the 19th discovered. He had less time to establish himself. The evidence from the Wolf Time suggests he was manipulated, that his loyalty to the Emperor was turned against him by some external agency that used that loyalty as the mechanism of whatever went wrong. The Custodes were directly involved in what followed, which suggests that what happened with the 11th was either a threat to the palace directly or a matter of supreme imperial sensitivity. The 11th may have been the more recent and the more sympathetic of the two tragedies. A shorter story, a more obvious deception, a clearer sense that what happened to him was not entirely his fault. The Rangdan Xenocides provided the context in which both of these situations developed or came to a head. The second, active in the Eastern Fringe, may have encountered whatever made the Rangda so dangerous in ways that accelerated or catalyzed his transformation. The 11th, discovered as the Xenocides were winding down, may have been manipulated specifically by a force that had been watching the Crusade and identified the 11th's legion as a vulnerability, a legion with a new and not yet fully established Primarch who could be turned before. He had time to develop the resistance that the older, more experienced Primarchs had built up. Leman Russ was sent, at separate times, within a 4-year window in the 960 SM30, to end both of these situations. The Space Wolves did what Space Wolves do. The two events are listed in the Forge World timeline as involving Space Wolves activity, with all data redacted. 2 operations 4 years apart. 2 legions ended. The survivors mind-wiped by Malkador and reintegrated into other forces, most probably including the Ultramarines, based on that legion's dramatic growth in numbers. The decision to erase all records, alter all memories, and bury the history was made by Dorn and Guilliman, implemented by Malkador, and authorized by the Emperor. The reasoning was not primarily to hide crimes. It was to prevent the knowledge of what had happened from undermining the Great Crusade's momentum and the Imperium's founding mythology at a critical moment. The Crusade needed to keep going. The Primarchs needed to keep fighting. The knowledge that 2 of the Emperor's sons had failed catastrophically in ways that required their brothers to be sent against them would have been deeply corrosive to the morale and unity of the entire enterprise. And so the doors were sealed. The statues were removed or their faces changed. The names were struck from the stone. The memories were taken. The soldiers were reprogrammed and redeployed. The chapter was closed. But the chapter leaves traces. It always does. The shape of a cut is visible in the material around it. The shape of an absence is visible in the space where something was and no longer is. And 10,000 years on, the empty plinths still stand, and Subject 11 waits in the dark, and a Mechanicus Archmagos, with 10,000 years of classified research, quietly works toward reopening, a conversation that the Lord of the Imperium closed once before, and may not be able to close again. The 2 who did not come home, the Forgotten and the Purged, 2 separate tragedies that, if Rogel Dorn was right to wonder, were warnings that no one heeded. Perhaps we are still not heeding them. In the grim darkness of the far future, some wounds never close, they just go quiet. And quiet is not the same thing as healed. End of complete script. Expansion, the Damnatio Memoriae, and the mechanics of Imperial forgetting. One aspect of the Lost Primarch story that deserves its own focused attention is the specific mechanism by which the erasure was carried out, and what that mechanism reveals about the Imperium's institutional relationship with its own history. Because what happened to the 2nd and 11th Legions was not just a military action or a political decision. It was an act of systematic obliteration that drew on every tool the Imperium possessed for the management of information and memory, and it represents perhaps the most complete exercise of those tools in the Imperium's entire history. The formal term for what was done to the lost Primarchs, at least by some interpretations of the lore, is damnatio memoriae in High Gothic, a formal condemnation of memory itself. This practice has roots in ancient human history on Old Earth, where the Romans would sometimes vote to erase a person from all public records, remove their statues, and forbid the mention of their name in public life. The condemned person was not necessarily killed. They might continue to exist physically, but they were removed from the social and historical fabric that gave them meaning and identity. They became non-persons, entities without record, people whose impact on the world was officially pretended not to have happened. The Imperium elevated this practice into something far more thorough and far more absolute. They have a formal designation for excommunicated enemies, excommunicate traitores, and they have the capacity to apply damnatio memoria through the combined weight of the administratum's record-keeping capacity, the ecclesiarchy's control of public narrative, and Malcador's psychic reach as one of the most powerful minds in the history of humanity. The combination of these three forces, applied to the same subject simultaneously, created something that went beyond any historical precedent for erasure. The physical destruction of records is the obvious starting point. Imperial records in the 30th and 31st millennia were stored in multiple formats: carved stone, written parchment, data crypt entries, oral traditions maintained by remembrancers, and the personal memories of millions of people who had served, fought alongside, reported to, or interacted with the 2nd and 11th Legions. Each of these had to be addressed separately. Stone and parchment and data crypts are relatively straightforward, if labor-intensive. You send in teams and you remove, alter, or destroy the relevant material. This would have required enormous resources and years of work. There were worlds throughout the galaxy that had been conquered under the banner of the 2nd and 11th Legions. Worlds where the victory had been recorded and commemorated and celebrated in the specific names of the legions that had liberated them. All of that had to go. Every monument, every banner, every inscription. The scope of the physical erasure alone is staggering to contemplate. But physical records are only the beginning. The real challenge, and the reason Malcador's psychic power was essential, was the people. The hundreds of thousands of humans, remembrancers, embedded journalists, Imperial Army soldiers, administrators, diplomats, civilian populations who had interacted with the 2nd and 11th Legions during the decades of the Great Crusade. Each of these people carried memories that were, in a very real sense, more dangerous than any physical record. Physical records can be found and destroyed. Human memory is distributed, backed up in millions of separate containers, and cannot be systematically eliminated through any means other than killing every person who carries the relevant knowledge, which would have required a massacre of such scope that it would itself have become a historical event, requiring suppression. Malcador's solution was psychic alteration at mass scale. Using the full capacity of his abilities, augmented presumably by the Imperium's most sensitive psychic resources, and working over an extended period, he systematically altered the relevant memories in the population of people who had to be reached. He could not reach everyone. Some memories were too remote, some people too psychically resistant, some records too obscurely filed. But he could reach enough to make the erasure functional, and the physical destruction of records covered much of what the psychic alterations left behind. The most significant target for the psychic alterations was not ordinary civilians, but the Primarchs themselves. Because the Primarchs, who had personally known the 2nd and 11th, a small number, given the generally distant relationships between brothers who were spread across a galaxy of campaigns, carried memories that were both more specific and more dangerous than any civilian's knowledge. A Primarch remembering something in detail is a Primarch capable of reconstructing a history from that detail, capable of connecting fragments and drawing conclusions that ordinary humans could not. The alteration of Primarch memories could not be as complete as the alteration of civilian memories. Malcador was powerful, but the psychic mass of a Primarch is something categorically beyond that of any normal human, and attempting a full erasure on a Primarch would have either failed or caused brain damage that would have been immediately apparent. Instead, what Malcador did was more surgical. He specifically suppressed the names. He removed the anchors. He left intact the general emotional impressions, the grief, the sense of loss, the awareness that brothers had once been there, but removed the specific identifying information that would allow those impressions to be connected to real historical facts. He took the labels off the feelings without removing the feelings themselves. This is why Dorn, in the chamber at the end of memory, can feel the absence of his brothers without being able to say who they were. He has the emotion without the content. He knows he grieves, but cannot say for whom. He knows something is missing, but cannot say what. The suppression is precisely targeted to prevent utility while leaving the human experience of loss intact, which is in some ways more cruel than a complete erasure would have been. And then there is the oath. The first heretic reveals that throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade, after the erasure was carried out, the surviving Primarchs swore an oath not to speak about the lost Primarchs. Not an oath imposed on them from above, an oath they took themselves, presumably with full understanding of what they were committing to. The combination of Malcador's psychic suppression and this voluntary oath created a system of silence that was both external and internal, both imposed and chosen. The Primarchs could not remember specifics, and they had agreed not to discuss even the vague impressions that remained. The oath explains why even characters like Magnus the Red, who is famously dismissive of rules he considers beneath him, observe the prohibition. Magnus is reminded of it by Mortarion during 1,000 Suns and goes quiet immediately. Mortarion says the Emperor forbade it, but the phrasing in other sources suggests the Primarchs themselves also chose this silence. It is both a command and a commitment. You cannot violate a command you agreed to impose on yourself. The result of all of this, applied over decades, and then maintained through the Horus Heresy and the 10,000 years that followed, is the most complete exercise in institutional memory management that the setting has ever depicted. The only partial failures are the ones we have been cataloging throughout this discussion. The accidental document in the primer, the fragments that snuck into novels, the empty plinths that could not be removed without creating more questions than their presence raised. These are the cracks in a structure that, by any reasonable assessment, achieved something extraordinary. The effective erasure of two beings from the consciousness of a civilization spanning 1,000,000 worlds. That this erasure has held for 10,000 years is its own kind of testament to the thoroughness of the original work. Whatever Malcador did, it was done well. The Imperium, which cannot manage to keep almost any other secret with any reliability, has managed to keep this one so completely that the people most likely to be curious about it, the scholars, the historians, the inquisitors who make it their business to know what the Imperium does not want them to know, have in most cases never even been given enough information to know there is a gap to investigate. The mystery is maintained by the completeness of its own concealment. Most people cannot ask the right questions because they do not know enough to formulate them. The lost Primarchs are hidden not in a vault or a sealed document, but inside the absence of knowledge that their own erasure created. The best place to hide something is in the emptiness left by the thing itself having been removed. You never notice the gap if you never knew there was something filling it. And this is also, perhaps, the most profound statement the Lost Primarch story makes about the Imperium as a whole, that its secrets are not primarily kept in hidden rooms or encrypted databanks. They are kept inside people's heads, in the spaces between what they know and what they are able to think to ask. The Imperium's most powerful tool of suppression is not the Inquisition, though that is certainly effective. It is the careful management of what questions are imaginable in the first place. If you never teach people that there were 20 sons, they will never think to ask about the 2 who are missing. This is the Imperium's deepest and most insidious form of control, not what you are forbidden to know, but what you have been prevented from thinking to ask. The Lost Primarchs are the most complete example of that principle in the entire setting, and the fact that we are here, asking these questions, following these threads, assembling these fragments into something that resembles a picture, this is itself a kind of defiance. Not of the Imperium, which is fictional, but of the tendency to accept what we are told without looking for what we are not told. Look at what is not there. Feel the shape of what is missing. That is where the real history lives. On the question of return, could the lost Primarchs come back? With the Lion El'Jonson and Roboute Guilliman both having returned to active play in the modern 41st millennium, the Lion waking from his long sleep in the rock, Guilliman resurrected by the will of the Emperor, and the desperate need of the Indomitus Crusade, a natural question presents itself. Is there any possibility that the lost Primarchs could be part of Games Workshop's future narrative plans? The honest answer requires separating two different questions. Could they come back narratively within the lore, and would Games Workshop choose to bring them back? On the first question, the lore technically leaves the door open, though it does not swing invitingly on its hinges. We do not know for certain that the lost Primarchs are dead. Dorn, in the chamber at the end of memory, refers to them as gone rather than dead, a careful word choice that may or may not be significant. Subject 11, in the Dark Cells, could be a living thing. The dimensional mirror in Belisarius' Call, the Great Work, shows 20 figures, which is a tantalizing image of a possible reality where they exist. The gene seed data that Call has collected means that at minimum, the potential to create something genetically related to the lost Primarchs survives. There is also the structural precedent set by the return of the existing Primarchs. If Roboute Guilliman can come back after 10,000 years of comatose stasis, and if Lion El'Jonson can wake from a sleep of similar length, then the biology of Primarch survival over extremely long timescales has been established as possible within the setting. Whatever happened to the lost Primarchs, if it did not involve complete physical destruction, a mechanism for survival and eventual return might be imagined. But whether Games Workshop would choose this path is a very different question, and the answer to it seems overwhelmingly to be no, at least not in any form that fully reveals who the lost Primarchs were and what happened to them. The reason is that the lost Primarchs' greatest value to the setting is their absence, and revealing them fully would permanently sacrifice that value for a one-time narrative event. The return of Guilliman was powerful, because Guilliman was established, loved, missed, and had a specific and developed identity that the return could expand on. The return of the Lion worked, because the Lion had enormous history and personality that a revival could explore. The lost Primarchs have no such foundation. They are defined entirely by their unknownness. A revealed lost Primarch would need to be built from scratch as a fully realized character, and in being built from scratch would immediately disappoint the enormous variety of theories and emotional investments that fans have built around the mystery. No answer could satisfy the range of hopes that the blank space contains. More importantly, once revealed, the mystery cannot be put back. The most powerful aspect of the Lost Primarchs story is that it is always happening, always present, always generating new consideration. The mystery is a live thing. A resolution would be a death, a final, definitive closing of something that has been open and breathing for 4 decades. What seems more likely, and what the recent history of Games Workshop's approach to this subject suggests, is exactly what has been happening. More fragments, more carefully placed clues, more additions to the archaeology of the mystery, without any revelation of the artifact at its center, more references in passing, more characters who almost say something, more blacked-out entries in new publications. The lost Primarchs will continue to be lost. Subject 11 will continue to wait, the empty plinths will continue to stand, and the community will continue to gather around the mystery, turning over the fragments, following the threads, feeling the shape of what is not there. This is, in the end, the most honest kind of story, one that knows what it cannot say, and instead shows you the silence around it, and trusts you to understand that the silence is itself the point. The shape of what is missing is the story, truly the end of the script. The emotional weight of erasure, what the brothers remembered, and what they lost. We have spent a great deal of time examining the mechanics of the Lost Primarchs mystery, the clues, the timeline, the theories, the specific sources that contain each piece of evidence. But there is an aspect of the story that is easy to lose in the archaeological detail, and it is perhaps the most important. The human cost, as much as superhuman beings can have a human cost, of what was done to the memories of the surviving Primarchs. Consider what it would be like to lose a brother, and then be made to forget you had ever had him. Not the straightforward loss of death, which is grief. Grief is clean, in the sense that it knows its own subject, knows what is missing. You remember the person. You feel the absence in relation to the presence you remember. The grief has a shape, because it was shaped by the real and specific person who is now gone. You can say their name. You can describe their face. You can tell stories about them. The pain is enormous, but it is anchored. It has something to hold on to. What Malcador did to the surviving Primarchs is something different. He gave them grief without an anchor. He left the emotional wound without the knowledge that generates it normally. They feel the loss. Vulcan explicitly says he grieves. Sanguinius's fear of a third empty plinth is the fear of someone who has already felt the weight of two, but they cannot say what they are grieving for. They cannot name it. They reach for the memory of their brothers and find a blur, a smear, an impression of a person without the person's substance. This kind of loss, bereavement without specific memory, mourning without a clear subject, is in some ways more distressing than ordinary grief. Because ordinary grief, however painful, can at least process itself. You can talk about the person. You can share memories with others who also remember. You can build a narrative of loss that allows the mind to eventually incorporate the absence into a stable picture of the world. Grief has a timeline. It moves, however slowly. But the grief Malcador imposed on the surviving Primarchs cannot move. It has no content to process. They cannot talk about their missing brothers, cannot even say, "I am sad about the second." They cannot say the second. They know only that something is wrong, that the world is missing something, that two presences that should be there are not there. And they cannot do anything with that knowledge, because they cannot see it clearly enough to engage with it. It is the emotional equivalent of trying to scratch an itch you cannot locate. The discomfort is real. The cause is inaccessible. Think about what this meant during the decades of the Great Crusade after the erasure. The surviving 18 Primarchs, or some subset of them, who had actually met the two missing brothers, went about their campaigns carrying this vague, persistent wrongness, this sense of incompleteness that no one would discuss, and that they themselves could not fully name. Some of them, like Vulcan, managed to access enough of the feeling to say the word grief in relation to it. Others may have suppressed even that much, wrapped the inexplicable sadness in the armor of pragmatism, and continued fighting, because that was what they were built to do, and fighting did not require you to know why you were sad. And then the Horus Heresy came, and the Primarchs began to die in earnest. Ferrus Manus at Istvan V, Sanguinius at the Siege of Terra, and the grief that had already been accumulating without a proper subject was multiplied, and the surviving brothers had to find a way to keep functioning under the weight of losses they could see clearly, and losses that were older and stranger and impossible to properly mourn. Rogel Dorn, building the defenses of the palace as the traitor fleet approached, walking past those two empty plinths, feeling the specific wrongness of two brothers who were absent, he carried that alongside the fresher grief of Ferrus Manus and the anticipation of more losses to come. He was building a fortress to protect the Emperor who had, years before, removed brothers that Dorn himself had chosen to forget, and Dorn did not even have the clarity to fully connect those two facts in his own mind. The Horus Heresy is often described, in both the internal lore and in commentary about the setting, as a tragedy above all other things. It is the story of brothers choosing wrong sides, of loyalty corrupted and ambition metastasizing, of the greatest project in human history tearing itself apart. But the Lost Primarchs' story is an older tragedy, a quieter one, a tragedy that had already finished its worst by the time the heresy began. The heresy was, among other things, the fruit of a world where Primarchs already knew, even without being able to say it clearly, that they were not safe. That being a son of the Emperor was not a guarantee of anything, that the project could swallow you if you failed it, and that failure, when it came, looked like erasure rather than defeat. In the first Heretic, when Lorgar and Magnus discuss the possibility of the word-bearers being purged, the emotional undercurrent of the conversation is not just fear of military force, it is fear of nothingness, of becoming what the two unnamed brothers became, a gap in the record, a blur in the minds of those who might once have loved you, a name that could not be said. The traitor Primarchs who went to chaos, whatever they gave up in the process, at least kept their names, at least kept the reality of their existence, however condemnatory the record of that existence might be. The lost Primarchs did not even get that. Horus understood this, which is why he stood in front of that statue and refused to let Malcador destroy it. Horus, who would go on to commit the greatest betrayal in human history, who would choose chaos and war and the destruction of everything his father had built in that moment, he was arguing for memory, for the right of a person who had fallen to be remembered as real. He was arguing against the cold institutional logic that said a failed son was no son at all, that a Primarch who had reached the wrong end of his story should be retroactively subtracted from the beginning. Horus lost that argument, and you could make the case, looking at everything that followed, that losing it did something to him, that watching Malcador literally strangle him to prevent him from speaking a name, that experiencing the brute enforcement of forgetting against his will, the violent demonstration that the Emperor's project would erase rather than acknowledge its failures, planted something in him that would eventually grow into the decision to tear the whole thing down rather than keep propping up a structure that operated on those terms. This is speculation about the inner life of a fictional character, but it is the kind of speculation that the text invites. Horus went to Davin and was wounded and was corrupted, but he was already, by then, a man who had stood in front of a statue of an erased brother and been choked to the ground for refusing to forget him. He had already seen what the Imperium was willing to do to maintain its chosen version of itself. The corruption at Davin found fertile ground partly because the ground had been prepared long before, in a courtyard outside the Imperial Palace, beside a statue that was eventually destroyed anyway. This is the tragedy beneath the tragedy. The lost Primarchs are not just a mystery about two people who disappeared. They are an event that had consequences, that shaped the people who remained, that contributed in ways impossible to precisely measure, but very possible to feel to the climate that produced the heresy. The erasure was not a clean solution to a contained problem. It was an act that rippled outward through every relationship, every oath, every brother who was left carrying the ambient weight of a loss he could not name. And it is entirely possible that the ripples it created are part of what eventually sank the ship. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But before the war came the silence. And the silence came from a choice the Emperor made, and a wall Malcador built, and two sealed doors in a tower that should not have existed, and two brothers who became the shape of a secret that the Imperium still cannot quite bring itself to forget, even after 10,000 years of trying. We will never know their names. We will never know exactly what they did. We will never know whether they chose their fate or had it chosen for them, whether they were villains or victims, or something in between that does not have a clean category. We will only ever know the shape of the space they left behind. And the space is enormous. If this deeply explored look at one of the greatest mysteries in the entire 40K universe resonated with you, there is one simple thing you can do. Subscribe. Hit that button. Turn on notifications, because this is what we do here. We go deep, we go slow, we follow every thread until it runs out or leads somewhere extraordinary. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 is vast enough to spend a lifetime in, and I intend to spend considerable time exploring the parts of it that rarely get the attention they deserve. Drop a comment telling me your theory on the lost Primarchs. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Tell me the time it is where you are. I genuinely want to know, because the community that gathers around this material is one of the most thoughtful and engaged fandoms in all of speculative fiction. And knowing where you all are reminds me that curiosity about these stories reaches further than I can see. The mystery is alive. Let's keep it that way. Final end of script. A note on sources and what they confirm. For those who want to do their own deep dive, it is worth cataloging the specific primary sources that contain confirmed, genuine lore references to the lost Primarchs, as opposed to fan theories or secondhand summaries. Every piece of evidence discussed in this video traces back to specific published material, and knowing which books and stories to read gives you the complete picture directly from the source. The Lightning Tower, by Dan Abnett. This is the short story where Rogel Dorn stands before the empty plinths and reflects on his absent brothers. It is perhaps the most atmospheric and emotionally resonant piece of Lost Primarchs lore in the entire Black Library catalog, and it is short enough to read in a single sitting. It does not reveal anything specific, but what it does is establish the emotional register of the whole mystery, the tone of quiet, complicated grief that runs through every subsequent reference. False Gods by Graham McNeill. This is the second novel in the main Horus Heresy series, where Horus is wounded on Davin and experiences warp visions that include a glimpse of the 11th Primarch's gestation tank. The vision is framed as a chaos-manipulated experience rather than a reliable historical record, but the detail about the 11th's untapped glories and Horus's reaction to Tank 11 is here and nowhere else. The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden. This is the single most information-dense source for Lost Primarchs lore currently available. The conversation between Lorgar and Magnus, the vision of the Gal Vorbak that references the 11th Primarch's innocence in infancy, the phrase, the forgotten and the purged, the confirmation that the Emperor personally carried out the purges, the mention of the oath taken by the surviving Primarchs not to discuss their missing brothers. All of it is here, in a single novel that rewards careful reading. Fear to Tread by James Swallow. Sanguinius's terror at the empty plinths and his declaration that he will not be responsible for a third plinth is here. It is a brief moment in a longer novel, but the emotional weight of it is extraordinary. Fulgrim, The Palatine Phoenix by Josh Reynolds. The description of the second Primarch as the normally contemplative master of the second, who was quiet and humorless, is in this Primarch series novel. It is currently the only personality description of either Lost Primarch available in official sources. The Chamber at the End of Memory by Nick Kime, the short story where Rogel Dorn discovers the hidden tower, confronts Malcador, has his memories temporarily restored, and learns the basics of who was responsible for the cover-up. This is as close as the lore gets to directly explaining the mechanics of the erasure. The Last Council, the short story where Horus argues against Malcador's destruction of a Lost Primarch statue and is choked before he can speak a name. The syllables M, Mal, Al appear here. Prospero Burns, by Dan Abnett Lehman Russ's comment that the Space Wolves have already performed the role of Astartes, sanctioning Astartes, before the Thousand Sun situation is here, along with Caspar Hauser's reference to the Emperor's 18 legions Astartes, confirming the lost legions were already gone by that point. The Wolftime by Guy Haley, the Custodes' reference to their history with the 11th Legion and the discussion of manipulation and lies, is in this modern-era Dawn of Fire novel. Dark Imperium, 2021 revised edition by Guy Haley Gillimans. Correction of the priest's mythology about 18 Primarchs is here, confirming explicitly from a primary Primarch source that there were 20. Codex, Adeptus Custodes, 9th edition. Subject 11's mention in the Dark Cells section is here. The Horus Heresy Book 1, Betrayal by Forge World. The blacked out table with measurable name lengths is here. The Horus Heresy Book 2, Massacre by Forge World. The two all-data redacted entries with Space Wolves participation in 965 and 969 M30 are here. The Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno by Alan Bly. References to the Rangdan Xenocides and the Space Wolves' Darkest War are here. Each of these sources is real, published, and available to any fan who wants to verify the claims made in this video. Nothing in what we have discussed is invented or speculated without basis. Every single fragment we examined tonight traces back to a specific published page, a specific sentence, a specific authorial choice that someone made deliberately and that has been sitting in the record, waiting to be found and assembled ever since. The mystery is maintained by what is not said. But what is said in these specific sources, in these specific moments, is enough to feel the shape of what the missing truth must look like. Read them. Follow the threads yourself. The picture that emerges from doing your own research is always richer than the one that comes from being told what is there. And with material this layered and this deliberately crafted, the rewards for close reading are extraordinary. The lore rewards the curious. It always has. It always will. And on that note, thank you for watching. Subscribe, comment your theories, tell me where you are in the world, and I will see you in the next one, wherever the lore takes us.